When Pope Francis was elected 2 years ago, as the New Statesman reports, he had a number of firsts to his name: the first Jesuit Pope, the first from the Americas, the first from the Southern Hemisphere. Since his ascension to the head of the Catholic Church, there's no doubt that he's changed the tone coming out of the Vatican from that of his predecessors. The Jesuits, the Society of Jesus to give the religious order its full name, is a religious community traditionally concerned with outreach, a degree of theological free thinking, and a focus on social justice. It's perhaps no surprise that Francis, with his tradition of outreach among the impoverished in his native Argentina, has been hailed by many as the Pope of the Poor. Associated Press called him the slum bishop. He has ostentatiously distanced himself from some of the sumptuousness you might associate with his position, the Catholic Church hierarchy not traditionally being shy of a bit of luxury. Francis has opted to live in the modest Casa Santa Marta rather than the lavish papal palace. One of his first moves was to censure and then, as the official euphemism has it, to accept the resignation of Bishop Frans Peter Tebarts van Elst after his spending had him dubbed the Bishop of Bling. He even splurged £12,000 for a bathtub, the International Business Times explains, which may explain why the Pope has asked the local faithful to rediscover a climate of charity. Such papal humility has gone down well. "I was always looking for a community," the Pope told the National Catholic Review America magazine. And with these kinds of actions, he's found it, in spades. In September, when Pope Francis began his tour of the US, he provoked both confusion and raptures by swapping the traditional swagger of the specially designed Pope-mobile for a tiny Fiat, which Fox News nervously reported was the least reliable car you could buy. It's no surprise this Pope has caught the attention of the media in an unprecedented way, or that he's used that attention to push his agenda. As the Financial Times reports in their article, 6 Key Moments in the Reign of Pope Francis, he has focused on the plight of the poor and marginalised around the world, as well as building bridges with more liberal Catholics. So is that agenda a radical one? In an interview with the Italian daily La Stampa in December 2014, he was asked what it felt like to be called a Marxist. He responded that the Marxist ideology is wrong, but went on to criticise trickle-down economics. The promise was that when the glass was full, it would overflow, benefiting the poor. But what happens instead is that when the glass is full, it magically gets bigger. Nothing ever comes out for the poor. And this is far from the only time he's made political interventions. He has shown himself to be relatively and outspokenly progressive on a number of surprising issues. The first of the Financial Times' 6 Key Moments is back in July 2013, just 4 months after he became Pope and long before the migrant crisis grabbed attention in Europe. On his first visit outside Rome, the FT reports, he denounced the globalisation of indifference to the plight of migrants. In what some have deemed a quiet revolution, Pope Francis has continued to make bold interventions ever since. In 2015, his encyclical on climate change was released, causing an even bigger stir. The Guardian ran a piece called "Pope's Climate Change Encyclical Tells Rich Nations, Pay Your Debt to the Poor." In it, they referred to it as a document infused with an activist anger and concern for the poor, casting blame on the indifference of the powerful in the face of certain evidence that humanity is at risk following 200 years of misuse of resources. The Washington Post wrote an article about the top 5 things the Pope gets right about climate change and reported that his aggressive position on climate change has been one of his most applauded moves, though as we see, not only applauded. On his visit to the US in September, the Pope also spoke out against the death penalty. In Al Jazeera's article, Pope Francis calls for end to death penalty, they reported his speech regarding our responsibility to protect and defend human life at every stage of development, which concluded with a call for the global abolition of the death penalty. In the same speech, at a time when the migrant crisis in Europe finally reached the mainstream media, Pope Francis again repeatedly stressed the need for compassion for immigrants. The Guardian asked, will Pope Francis have a lasting effect on the US immigration debate? And noted that he attempted to hush an at times ugly and xenophobic clamour with passionate appeals for compassion and recognition that immigrants built the United States. He told Congress, "I say this to you as the son of immigrants, knowing so many of you are also descended from immigrants." He has even targeted capitalism itself, at least in what he calls its unfettered form. In what the Telegraph called a blistering attack on the new colonialism of austerity, he described unfettered capitalism as the dung of the devil, saying that poor countries should not be reduced to being providers of raw material and cheap labour for developed countries. It's hardly any surprise that the American right wing, including prominent Catholic members of the Republican Party, have been apoplectic. George Will in the Washington Post unleashes a torrent of abuse on what he calls Francis's fact-free flamboyance and sanctimony. In Time magazine, Republican Congressman and Catholic Paul Gosar announces, with the tears of a disappointed fanboy, that he will boycott the Pope's speech to Congress because of all the climate stuff. Media Matters for America put together an article collecting what it described as the worst reactions of the conservative media to the Pope, particularly with regard to climate change. One Breitbart article called the Pope's position dubious science you might expect from a 16-year-old. Others on the list included the Patriot Post article, Barack Francis, Hot Air and Social Justice, which said the Pope was acting as a water boy for the UN. Huffington Post separately reported Fox News pundit Greg Gutfeld calling the Pope the most dangerous person on the planet for suggesting that climate change is real. There is another side to this. Others are less convinced by the Pope's seemingly left-wing rhetoric. It's very notable, though perhaps not surprising, that while he did suggest that priests ought to forgive women who seek forgiveness about their abortions, the Vatican's position on women's reproductive rights, abortion and birth control haven't changed. As The Economist reports in its article, Is the Pope a Liberal?, he has upheld church teaching on abortion, allowing women to repent and be forgiven could hardly be described as laid back. And as a New York Times editorial, The Pope and the Birth Control Ban points out, the church establishment under Pope Francis continues to oppose access to birth control. The Holy See's delegation at the United Nations has objected to the inclusion of contraception and reproductive rights in worldwide development goals. It is not just on women's reproductive rights that the Pope's words have not been reflected in a meaningful shift in rules. His comments on LGBT issues have also led to some to doubt that he will bring any real change to the church's position. In a piece titled, Pope Francis's Mixed Messages on Sexuality, the New York Times notes that although he has tended to take a pastoral approach, calling on the Church to love and care for all, there is also plenty of evidence that Pope Francis stands firmly on Church teachings on the traditional family and opposing same-sex marriage. Likewise, The Economist begins by describing how the Pope has used strikingly conciliatory language to speak of homosexuals. In response to a question about gay priests, he said, "Who am I to judge?" A clear break with the tenor of the approach of his immediate predecessors. However, it too goes on to remind that the Pope has also opposed gay marriage, repeatedly affirming that marriage is between a man and a woman. He has, The Economist states, come nowhere close to altering any of the Church's core doctrinal or social teachings. Far more damning was the socialist journal Jacobin in its article, Meet the New Church, Same as the Old, which notes that prior to Pope Francis, the Vatican had been increasingly losing legitimacy because of rampant sexual abuse and numerous cases of corruption. This explains Pope Francis's strategy of appearing to be innovative, progressive, and in touch with the modern world. His objective is clear, the article goes on, to recover the Church's terrain lost due to its outdated ideals and sordid past. But, it warns, we should not confuse these objectives with a supposed modernisation or change of the institution. Its patriarchal essence remains unchanged. But while most of the media's coverage has been looking at Pope Francis's interventions into world politics, there is arguably a more interesting debate to be had. Contrary to the implications of the Jacobin article, the Catholic Church and the Vatican does not have such a static history. Indeed, in the late 1960s, just such modernising liberal reformation was on the table as part of the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II. When this was announced by Pope John XXIII in 1959, in the words of NPR, it shocked the world. There hadn't been an ecumenical council to settle doctrinal issues for nearly a century. Overwhelmingly, the legacy of Vatican II is celebrated by progressives and radicals in the Church, many of whom say its spirit has been betrayed, unfinished and rolled back. In some respects, all culture wars in the Church since are over that legacy. Is Pope Francis, then, part of a revival of the ideals and aims of the Vatican II's reforms? In short, are we about to see major reforms to the Catholic Church? Important as this undoubtedly is, their macro-political focus tends to obscure other factors in the nature of this Pope's pronouncements, specifically incredible levels of toxicity, corruption and factionalism within the Vatican. The veil that is usually draped over such a state of affairs was ripped aside for the world in 2012 with what is sometimes called the VatiLeaks scandal. First revealed in an Italian TV documentary, The Untouchables, this is a complex and overlapping set of scandals, including corruption, infighting, and the blackmailing of gay clergy. One key element was Pope Benedict's response. As the BBC reported in May of 2012, he issued a statement describing the rumours as exaggerated, gratuitous, and causing a false image of the Vatican. Nothing to see here. But while Pope Francis has given the impression that he's interested in reform, the New Yorker piece continues to note that in his first 2 years, Francis, through the deployment of his modest personality and inclusive rhetoric, has skillfully created the impression of a much more open and tolerant church, without actually changing church doctrine. So, a radical, a stealth Marxist, a stealth conservative? Perhaps neither. Rather, Francis seems, in his theology and his practice, like a decent, sincere centrist, one committed to social justice and to the traditions of orthodoxy. The problem is that the balancing is not down to him alone, but to a whole institution that isn't keen to balance. And this is where his attempt to mediate tradition and outreach may come into conflict with his anti-factionalism agenda, because the latter means he's already partaking in the civil war that the former is likely intended to avoid. As Damian Thompson put it in late 2014 in the conservative British journal The Spectator, in the title of a piece fascinating for those interested in the nerdy pornography of theological bickering, "Watch out, Pope Francis, the Catholic Civil War has begun."